Imagine a conflict so massive, so unbelievably devastating, that over 20 million people lost their lives. A war where entire, centuries-old empires just completely disappeared from the map, leaving millions of soldiers trapped for years fighting in miserable, disease-ridden trenches. And honestly, the most mind-blowing part of the whole thing? This entire global catastrophe was set into motion by just one single assassination. One event that literally changed the course of history forever.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the mechanics of a conflict that fundamentally reshaped the modern world as we know it, World War I. How exactly did it all begin? And why on earth did so many countries from completely different continents get dragged into the fight? We're going to travel back to 1914 to uncover the explosive geopolitical ingredients that created the Great War. Let's dive in.
Part 1. Europe's Powder Keg, the build-up to 1914.
To really understand the tension leading into 1914, we have to look at the MAIN framework. And this wasn't just, passive political posturing. First, we have militarism. Nations like Germany and Britain were actively locked in this massive, escalating arms race. Then there's imperialism. This was an incredibly aggressive scramble for the exact same colonial resources in Africa and Asia, which obviously bred some deep resentments. Throw in some fierce, uncompromising nationalism, especially the intense demands for autonomy in the highly volatile Balkans region, and, well, the continent was basically a giant powder keg just waiting for a match.
That brings us to the A in our framework, alliances. Europe was essentially a loaded spring, split right down the middle into two heavily armed camps. On one side, you've got the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other, the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia. Now, here's the crucial thing to remember. These weren't just friendly diplomatic handshakes. These were strict, binding legal contracts. If just one of these nations went to war, their heavily armed allies were legally obligated to jump in with them. It was perfectly engineered for a massive chain reaction.
Part 2. The Spark and Spiral, a chain reaction. So, here is where the dominoes fall, and it happens terrifyingly fast. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is visiting Sarajevo. A Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip assassinates him. That one event, just a few bullets on a street in Sarajevo, instantly triggers that entire alliance network we just talked about. Austria-Hungary immediately blames Serbia. Because of their pacts, Russia mobilizes to back Serbia, which prompts Germany to step up for Austria-Hungary. France jumps in for Russia. And then, when Germany decides to invade neutral Belgium just to bypass French defenses, well, Britain is forced to enter the chat. In a matter of weeks, the entire continent is engulfed in war.
Part 3. A new kind of hell. The reality of warfare.
Now, Germany had this grand, rather arrogant strategy called the Schlieffen Plan. They basically expected to march in, rapidly defeat France, and then quickly pivot east to take care of Russia. The military leaders literally promised their citizens a swift, glorious victory. But the reality on the ground? It shattered that illusion almost immediately. Instead of a quick conquest, the conflict completely stalled out into a long, agonizing stalemate. No quick victory, just millions of casualties with absolutely no end in sight.
When those advancing armies stalled, they literally dug in. It is so hard to overstate just how miserable the Western Front actually was. Soldiers carved out hundreds of miles of muddy, freezing trenches into the earth. Imagine living in that for years. A world defined by constant rain, rampant disease, and massive rats scurrying over everything. And on top of all that physical misery, artillery shells were raining down constantly, day and night. The psychological toll was just unprecedented. It led to absolute epidemic levels of what doctors back then called shell shock, a severe trauma that we of course recognize today as PTSD.
And sitting right between these opposing trenches was a terrifying stretch of blasted mud known as no man's land. Millions of young men died in this wasteland just to gain, a few yards of territory? Actually trying to cross it meant almost certain death because modern machine guns positioned on either side could just mow down hundreds of charging soldiers in a matter of minutes.
This war was the exact moment where the brutal efficiency of the Industrial Revolution met the battlefield. We're talking horrific new technologies that completely outpaced traditional military tactics. Machine guns were far deadlier than the old rifles. Then came poison gas, like chlorine and mustard gas, causing unimaginably painful deaths. To try and break that trench stalemate, Britain rolled out the very first heavily armored tanks in 1916.
Up in the sky, airplanes went from being used for simple scouting to engaging in deadly aerial dogfights. And beneath the waves, German U-boats were waging unrestricted warfare, sinking Allied and even civilian ships. The human cost was just escalating exponentially.
Part 4. Turning the Tide. Major Battles and the U.S. Entry.
Looking at these major engagements, you realize they weren't even battles in the traditional sense. They were absolute meat grinders, pure attrition, where just surviving was the main objective. At the Battle of the Marne, the German advance was finally halted, which saved Paris, but the violence only escalated from there. I mean, the Battle of Verdun lasted for nearly 10 relentless months, resulting in roughly 700,000 casualties. The Battle of the Somme became one of the bloodiest days in history. Britain lost 60,000 soldiers on the very first day alone. And the Gallipoli campaign was a massive, ultimately failed attempt by the Allies to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. The stalemate seemed completely unbreakable.
Meanwhile, for years, the United States was desperately trying to remain completely neutral, but they eventually got dragged into the fray. First, Germany brought back its unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking American merchant ships. But the absolute final straw? A piece of intercepted intelligence called the Zimmermann telegram. In it, Germany actually encouraged Mexico to attack the United States in exchange for reclaimed territory. You can imagine how that went over. In 1917, the U.S. officially declares war, and the arrival of fresh American troops provided this massive, desperately needed boost to Allied morale and manpower.
Part 5. The Legacy of War. The Aftermath.
Fast forward to late 1917 and 1918, and the German war machine is literally running on fumes. They are facing rapid total collapse. Exhaustion, severe food shortages, absolute economic ruin. Their capacity to keep fighting simply evaporated. Their allies began throwing in the towel one by one. Finally, an armistice was struck. On November 11, 1918, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns across Europe finally went silent. The war was over. The very next year, in 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was drafted to make the peace official. But here is where things get really crucial, because the conditions of this peace treaty directly set the stage for future disaster. The Treaty of Versailles was remarkably harsh. It placed the blame for the entire global war squarely on Germany's shoulders. They were forced to take full responsibility, pay absolutely massive financial reparations, drastically cut down their military, and give up significant amounts of their own territory. Unsurprisingly, a lot of Germans felt this was deeply unfair, and it bred a fierce, simmering national resentment that would prove incredibly dangerous down the line.
When the dust settled, the geopolitical landscape was completely unrecognizable. World War I shattered the modern world. Ancient empires were erased basically overnight. The German Empire collapsed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disappeared entirely from the map. The Ottoman Empire, done. Borders were completely redrawn. And in an attempt to somehow maintain this fragile new reality, the League of Nations was created, specifically to make sure a global conflict like this never happened again.
But before we wrap up, I just want you to take a second to absorb this number directly from our sources. 40 million. That is the number of human beings who were killed or wounded in this one single conflict. 40 million lives ended or permanently altered. It's a staggering, sobering reminder of the truly enormous human cost of this war.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly important question. If the devastating lessons of the so-called war to end all wars were meant to prevent future tragedies, how did the deeply flawed peace of the Treaty of Versailles directly plant the seeds for the rise of Adolf Hitler and the horrors of World War II just 2 decades later? It's a stark reminder that how a war ends is often just as consequential as how it begins. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope this deep dive helped clarify the complex, shifting mechanics of the Great War. Keep learning, keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you next time.